Hitler's winter wonderland was the small alpine village of Obersalzberg, perched atop the mountains above the Bavarian town of Berchtesgaden in southern Germany. Hitler often spent 6 months of each year in residence at his large house, the Berghof, before the war, and also during the war several weeks each year, including several Christmases at the village. Having obtained a lot of film shot by Eva Braun during winter conditions at Obersalzberg, I decided to return to the area and see how it looks in comparison today under similar winter conditions, and give you some then and now comparisons. There is still plenty for the student of history to discover and explore. Let's begin our exploration of Hitler's Obersalzberg, as many people then and now arrive at the destination via the 5-kilometer road up from the town of Berchtesgaden. The first surviving Nazi-era buildings are on your right, called the Hinterreich. These were a collection of originally 4 large alpine chalets, providing married quarters for some of the SS officers based in the village. Today only 3 survive, one having been destroyed during the British bombing raid on the 25th of April 1945 that laid waste to much of Obersalzberg. These buildings are still private apartments today, and back on to some more modern chalet apartment blocks. On the opposite side of the road, set back from it, is an enormous structure. However, before you reach it, you will see this bunker entrance, which leads to the Hinterreich air raid tunnels that go back into the mountain for some distance. Turning away from these tunnels and climbing up a slight incline, you'll be confronted by this enormous building. In German, this is called the Cox Bunker, or coal bunker in English. Constructed in 1940 on the orders of Martin Bormann to hold 3,500 tons of coal. It is one of the most intact Third Reich-era structures on Obersalzberg, 20 meters tall and 36 meters wide, with many of its original doors still intact. The coal was poured in from trucks on the roadway above, and then smaller trucks collected coal from the openings below and then drove them to the various buildings to be used to provide heating, light and electricity in all the Nazi buildings on Obersalzberg. When I visited in the snow a few days ago, it was rather an eerie sight and put me in mind of the giant bunkers at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, now in Poland. Next is a very substantial surviving Nazi-era structure, the Göring Adjutancy, the official residence of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring's chief adjutant, General Karl Bodenschatz, and his staff when Göring was in residence at his house atop the adjacent Eckebickel Hill. Unlike Göring's house, the Adjutancy building survived the war without a scratch, and today is lived in as a private home. Hermann Göring's house was purchased for him by the state in 1936 and given to him as a gift, and he extensively expanded it, making it his official residence when he visited the Obersalzberg. Though it was only a small country house in comparison to his huge Karrenhall estate outside Berlin. The house was extremely badly damaged in the 1945 bombing raid. And a crater can still be seen beside where the house once stood, the last of its remains having been pulled down in the early 2000s to make way for the construction of the Kempinski Hotel that now dominates Obersalzberg and Eckebickel Hill. However, one famous Nazi-era feature does remain today: Hermans Hill, a small promontory above the house and a favorite seating area for the Reichsmarschall and his family and guests. Behind the hill, leading into the forest, is the only surviving section of Landhaus Göring, a broken flight of stone steps. However, all is not what it seems, for the very extensive Göring tunnel system is completely intact, connecting Landhaus Göring to the adjutant's building, with a surviving emergency exit built into the bank of the Eckebical Hill below where the house once stood. Needless to say, these tunnels are closed to visitors. Moving around to the opposite side of the Kempinski Hotel to a modern staff car park reveals a huge Nazi-era structure. These giant walls that hold up the hill that were once part of enormous greenhouses that supplied fresh fruit and vegetables to Hitler's kitchen and other kitchens on the Obersalzberg. The greenhouses were badly damaged by the bombing, and later they were torn out in the 1950s. The massive concrete walls were kept. Later they were used to support the hotel, which was built on top of the hill. Above the top of the greenhouses once stood a concrete bunker housing the Anti-Aircraft Defense and Communications Center, which controlled the flak batteries positioned in the surrounding mountains to protect the village from Allied bombers. When the hotel was built in 2004, this bunker was simply buried and still exists intact. The buried bunker connects to the Obersalzberg Anti-Aircraft Defense and Communications Center tunnel system, which is completely intact. Just down the hill from the greenhouse site and opposite the Hotel zum Türken is the entrance to that system. The original arched entrance was later made smaller in the 1980s, and a strong steel door put on to prevent access by the public. On the opposite side of the road is the Hotel zum Türken, one of the oldest buildings on Obersalzberg. The curious name comes from a veteran returning from war against the Turks in 1683. In 1911 it was converted from a house into a hotel, and in 1923 a young Hitler had lunch at the establishment with his mentor Dietrich Eckart. The owner was a critic of the early Nazis, however, and was forced to sell, along with many other owners of properties in the valley, to the Nazis in 1933. For most of the Nazi period, the hotel housed 19 of Hitler's bodyguards from the Reichssicherheitsdienst, the Reich Security Service, his close protection detail of mostly ex-German policemen, and was also a telephone exchange. It was adjacent to Hitler's home, the Berghof, and a wooden gate ran across the road with an SS sentry box, controlling access to the Fuhrer's house from this direction. During the 1945 British air raid, the hotel was badly damaged, but unlike so many of the other structures on Obersalzberg, it wasn't pulled down post-war, but instead it was repurchased by the original owners and repaired. It closed in 2018 and was sold in 2020, but currently remains closed though well maintained. Opposite and standing above the Hotel zum Türken was Martin Bormans' house. Reichsleiter Bormann, Hitler's powerful secretary and head of the Nazi Party organization throughout Germany, was called the Lord of Obersalzberg due to the power he wielded, and was responsible for forcibly purchasing homes in the valley and ordering the construction of new buildings and the massive tunnel system that still lies beneath the village today. Bormann's house was a large alpine chalet that conveniently overlooked Hitler's home, enabling Bormann to keep a close eye on comings and goings. Here Bormann lived with his wife and 10 children. The house was destroyed during the 1945 bombing raid, and its ruin pulled down in the early 1950s, and only scattered ruins can today be seen dotting the hillside. Bormans' personal bunker system, however, remains intact, though inaccessible beneath the hill. Below Bormans' house was the Unterwerflehen, the home of the chief of the Obersalzberg administration officers, SS Sturmbannführer Spahn. This building took a direct hit in 1945, blasting off a large chunk of the front, and the rest was pulled down in the early 1950s. However, a large amount of the original tin roof still lies at the site. Below these ruins, and set below the road that runs in front of Hitler's house, is one of the emergency exits for the Führer's bunker system. It's a bit of a treacherous climb down to it in winter conditions, but it is interesting as you can actually enter the first few feet of this tunnel. If you want to see what Hitler's bunker system looks like today, check out my video about it in the end screen. As this US soldier did in 1945, I clambered up the slope to the road, adjacent to the Berghof, Hitler's huge chalet home, or I should say the site of Hitler's home, for little remains of the house today. It is possible to make then and now comparisons at the site today, the bomb and fire damaged house having been blown up by the West German authorities in 1952. Here we see Hitler and Bormann walking down the stone steps outside the Berghof. And here is where those steps once stood. Here Hitler stands on the Berghof's drive, and the Hotel zum Türken visible behind him, and that view today. In fact, one of the few surviving features of the Berghof are parts of its driveway. Here Hitler and his Luftwaffe adjutant, Nicholas von Below, stand on that drive. Here Hitler plays with his dog, Blondie. He is standing to the rear of the terrace which stood above the Berghof's garage, and the retaining walls behind the wing of the house that juts out behind Hitler also survive today. The main entrance to Hitler's tunnel system beneath the Berghof was accessed through this section of the retaining wall, the rear of the house. The entrance is bricked up and lies beneath this pile of leaf litter several feet below modern ground level. If you want to see what the tunnels look like today, I've made a video all about it. See the link in the end screen. Another emergency exit for Hitler's bunker system beneath the house still exists today. It's on the far side of the present site, and again involves a bit of clambering around in the undergrowth. Interestingly, adjacent to it is another one of those bomb craters which litter the site, this one undoubtedly doing serious damage to the house in 1945. Next we leave the Berghof site and hike up the hill to the Hir Guest House, once used to house senior visiting officials and military officers to Hitler's home. Here we see what it originally looked like from the SS guard post behind the Platoff Hotel, looking down the hill we have just climbed. Although not damaged in the 1945 air raid, the building stood derelict for many decades before being developed into the original Obersalzberg Documentation Center, a display about the Nazi era. The building's top floor was lobbed off and replaced by a modern extension. A new documentation center opened a few years ago opposite, and the Hir Guest is now used for administration purposes. We now arrive at the huge Platoff Hotel site. Opened as a hotel in 1877, it was extensively remodeled and enlarged in the Nazi era, and used as a special guest house for dignitaries and officers visiting Obersalzberg. From 1943 to 45, it was converted into a military hospital and rest center. Badly damaged in the Allied air raid, it was restored and reopened in the 1950s as the Hotel General Walker, as Obersalzberg was taken over by the US Army as a rest and recreation center. Once it was returned to the German government in 1995, they decided to tear it down in 2000, which seems pretty unnecessary considering how popular the hotel was with tourists. However, one part of the Platoff was spared the wrecking ball, the Terrassenhalle, which the Americans had restored into a restaurant they called the Skyline Room. The rest of the Platoff site is now just a car park for the documentation center and for buses ferrying tourists to the Eagle's Nest, the Kelstein house far above. Moving on, we walk back towards the area of the Kempinski Hotel, passing by an area that was once stuffed full of buildings. In this field once stood the SS barracks that housed the Obersalzberg Guard Battalion, as well as many other important structures that are now completely gone. Badly damaged in the air raid, the whole lot was progressively pulled down after the war, leaving nothing but an empty field today. At the end of the road is a small guardhouse built post-war at the site of a gate from the Nazi era that controlled access to the road up to Kelstein Mountain and on to the Eagle's Nest. In this late 1930s film taken from the greenhouses, you can see the Eagle's Nest Road gate in the background. We will now go further afield to two places that still exist in some form and were closely associated with the Nazi leaders. The first is the Gutshof, an experimental farm constructed by Bormans in 1936. It lies at the foot of the hill down the road from the Berghof in the valley. To reach it, you pass the remains of a large SS guardhouse that once blocked the road to Hitler's house. It survived the war in a damaged state before being torn down. Today, its foundations are clearly visible beside the road. Opposite the entrance to the Gutshof still stands the studio and the house of Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments Production, Albert Speer. Please see my video about these intact structures, link in the end screen. The Gutshof is also mostly intact, though a huge multi-story wing was torn down in 2007. The Gutshof survived the RAF raid, mostly intact, and the Americans converted it into a golf course and winter ski resort. However, Eva Braun and many in Hitler's inner circle enjoyed skiing in this area long before the war. The final building to visit is only a short walk from the Gutshof, and when Hitler was in residence at the Berghof, he visited it every afternoon, walking one of two ways to the building, mostly downhill, and being driven back to his house by car afterwards. Here is Hitler and Bormann walking through the path in the forest towards the tea house. The Muslanerkopf tea house was Hitler's favorite building on Obersalzberg and was built for him on the orders of Martin Bormann in 1937. The tea house survived the RAF raid completely intact and was then extensively looted by US troops. but because it was Hitler's favorite, unlike the more famous Kelstein House, or Eagle's Nest as it is known to Western viewers, which he vocally disliked, it had to go. In 1951, the Muslanerkopf Teehaus was demolished, though a substantial amount of ruins survived until 2006, when they too were excised from the hill. The famous overlook has survived largely intact to the present, though the railings and bench are modern replacements. Here are some then and now shots of Hitler and his entourage at the famous overlook during World War II. Just a few remains of steps and foundations exist today, the last remnants of Hitler's favorite building on Obersalzberg. In a final shot, Hitler and Albert Speer walk back towards the Gutshof area. And a final building to explore, some quarter of a mile down the path from the overlook, positioned 50 feet or so below the path, is one of the last intact mole bunkers used by SS sentries that patrolled the forest, guarding Hitler's tea house 24 hours a day. In this lonely spot in the winter forest, you half expect to see a steel-helmeted SS sentry moving quietly among the fir trees, still patrolling his lonely beat 80 years after the end of the war. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.